Welcome to City Vision University's podcast, providing book summaries of books on rescue missions, city missions, and the Salvation Army.
It's great to be here.
And today we are looking at a statistic that is, frankly, just staggering.
Yeah, it really changes how you look at things.
It does. I mean, think about the last time you gave to a charitable cause, right? Maybe it's your local place of worship or a community center.
Sure.
Well, there's this research from the Lilly Endowment, and they're this major philanthropic foundation that studies religion and giving. And they found that almost half of all charitable giving by church attendees is not actually going to their local congregation.
Right, which is huge.
It's totally bypassing the local collection plate entirely. And it's flowing directly into what are called parachurch organizations.
And, it's a profound shift in American philanthropy. I mean, just so we are clear on the terminology here, when we say parachurch, we are talking about Christian faith-based organizations that operate outside of a specific local church denomination.
Right, so they're completely separate.
Exactly. They are independent entities. So think youth camps, global relief funds, media ministries, and of course, central to our deep dive today, rescue missions.
Yeah.
They work alongside the church, which is where you get the prefix para, but they have their own independent boards, their own budgets, and their own operational structures.
And the budgets we're talking about here are just mind-boggling. I mean, how did an operation that historically consisted of, a guy handing out bowls of soup on a street corner turn into a multi-million-dollar, highly sophisticated enterprise?
It's quite the evolution.
Today, we are exploring that exact evolution.
Yeah.
We're basing our analysis on this deeply insightful, honestly pivotal study from 1996 called From Soup and a Sermon to Mega Mission, a guide to financing rescue missions, edited by Ivan Fahs.
It's such a foundational text.
It really is. And we were going to explore how these quiet mom-and-pop storefronts transformed into these massive, sophisticated mega missions, handling incredibly complex social issues. And all while they're wrestling with this really intense tension between their deep spiritual convictions and the cold, hard realities of corporate fundraising.
Right, because to really grasp why this transformation had to happen, you first have to understand that the environment these missions operate in, like the literal pavement of the American city, fundamentally changed.
Yeah, the streets themselves changed.
Exactly. And Ivan Fahs, who edited our primary source material, he provides this fascinating, deeply personal lens on this.
Which I just love reading about.
It's incredible. He isn't just some academic compiling survey data from a comfortable university office somewhere.
Right.
In the 1950s, as a young man, Fahs actually lived on the streets of Chicago as a homeless person.
Wow. I mean, so he lived the actual reality he's studying.
He did.
That gives him just an incredible level of credibility. What was his experience like back then?
Well, he describes a very specific ecosystem. He lived around West Madison Street and the uptown area of Chicago. And at that time, the landscape was this mix of, honky-tonks, small diners, independent grocery stores, and really crucial to his survival, these small, accessible storefront rescue missions.
So they were just right there on the street?
Right. They were unassuming, completely integrated right into the commercial block. You could just walk in, get warm, get a meal, hear a sermon, and find a safe place to sleep.
Yeah.
It was a very localized, human-scale safety net. But the real catalyst for this whole book is what happens when Fahs, who is now a credentialed sociologist, returns to those exact same streets decades later.
Oh, man. I imagine the neighborhood didn't look exactly the same.
It didn't. The transformation was violently jarring.
Wow.
He describes walking down West Madison Street and finding that the entire ecosystem of small diners and single-room occupancy hotels is just gone.
Completely wiped out.
Yes. And more alarmingly, the old storefront rescue missions have completely vanished. The physical space they occupied has just been replaced.
Replaced by what?
Well, he describes seeing older buildings where the large glass display windows have been literally bricked up.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and vacant lots are now surrounded by these impenetrable chain-link fences. He notes that walking down the street felt like walking alongside a high prison wall.
That is just, it sounds like the physical architecture of the city was literally weaponized against the vulnerable.
It really was.
I mean, if you brick up a window, you are sending a very clear message, right? You're saying you are not welcome to even look inside.
Exactly. It is the visual language of gentrification and exclusion.
Yeah.
And there is one specific scene Fahs witnesses that really crystallizes the necessity for a new kind of mission.
What happens?
So he is standing near his old haunts, which have been bulldozed and replaced by luxury developments, specifically the Presidential Towers and Printers Row luxury condos.
Okay, so very high end.
Very. And as he's standing there, he watches uniformed private security personnel aggressively and physically remove homeless men from the opulent entrances of these buildings.
Oh my goodness.
Fahs writes that watching this made him physically sick.
And, I mean, let's just pause and think about what that means for your own city, for the listener.
Yeah, think about it.
Because if you look around your downtown today, you see this exact same thing.
Everywhere.
The defensive architecture, right?
Yeah.
The spikes on park benches so people can't sleep on them. The privatization of public space.
Right.
If the society around you is becoming armored and the mom and pop storefronts are being bulldozed for high rises, well, those small-scale charities simply cannot afford the rent anymore.
No, they can't.
They can't survive in that hostile landscape.
Precisely. The marginalized were essentially being squeezed into tighter, more dangerous corners.
Yeah.
The scale of modern urban poverty was intensifying, the local safety nets were disappearing, and yet, and this is the wild part, hidden from the general public's view, the rescue mission movement was quietly exploding to meet this new demand.
Wow.
They couldn't be mom and pop operations anymore because, well, the problems were no longer mom and pop problems.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because if they couldn't be mom and pop, what did they become? What does a mega mission actually look like under the hood?
So the book pulls data from a comprehensive study by the Christian Stewardship Association, the CSA.
Okay.
And they surveyed over 500 of these missions nationwide.
500? That's a massive sample size.
It is. Now, everyone knows they provide welfare services and spiritual guidance. That's universal. Like 100% of them do that.
Right.
And 94% provide homeless shelter. But the complexity of the services is where the mega prefix really comes in.
Give me an example of that complexity, because I feel like when most people hear rescue mission, they picture a cafeteria line and like some bunk beds.
Yeah, that is definitely the old paradigm.
Right.
New reality is that 70% of these organizations are running full-scale alcohol and drug rehabilitation programs.
Really? 70%?
Yes, and nearly 40% operate specialized shelters for battered women and abused children.
Wow.
A third of them have brought medical and dental care entirely in-house.
Wait. They are running in-house dental clinics and legal aid offices.
Yes, and 30% offer professional clinical psychological counseling. Some even handle legal counseling and family planning.
How do you even integrate something as clinical as dentistry with spiritual counseling and addiction recovery? Like, that seems so disjointed.
Well, that is the defining feature of the mega mission. They recognize that modern poverty is deeply intersectional.
Right.
You cannot simply hand a man a sandwich and expect him to get a job if his teeth are rotting out of his head, causing him chronic pain, and he has, say, outstanding legal warrants preventing him from passing a background check.
Of course. That makes total sense.
By bringing all these services under one roof, they create a holistic pipeline of recovery.
Right.
The medical clinic treats the acute physical pain, the rehab center handles the addiction, the legal aid clears the warrants, and the spiritual counseling provides the foundation for a new identity.
It is an incredibly sophisticated supply chain for human restoration.
It really is.
But, this leads to a massive contradiction that I just can't quite wrap my head around.
What's that?
Well, if these groups, these hundreds of missions, are essentially acting as shadow hospitals, legal clinics, and housing authorities,
Yeah.
why aren't they at the forefront of the national political conversation? I mean, you hear about government task forces all the time, you hear about loud advocacy groups staging protests, but you rarely hear about these private missions on the nightly news. Why are they so invisible?
It's a fascinating paradox, really, and it comes down to the underlying theology of their leadership.
Okay, how so?
The individuals running these missions operate from a deeply ingrained Christian worldview that actively shuns the spotlight. They do not view themselves as political advocates or social engineers seeking headlines. The book points out that they operate under the biblical mandate found in Ephesians, doing their work not as, men pleasers seeking human validation, but as quiet servants.
So they view PR and, political grandstanding as completely contrary to their spiritual mandate.
Yes, exactly. They are highly suspicious of anything that distracts from the individual life sitting right in front of them.
Right.
However, the authors argue this theological humility creates a really significant societal blind spot.
I can imagine.
Yeah, I mean, a publication at the time listed 22 national organizations deeply concerned with homelessness, and it completely omitted the International Union of Gospel Missions, the Salvation Army, and Catholic Charities.
That's absurd. I mean, that's like writing an article about global logistics, forgetting to mention FedEx and UPS.
It is. It really is. If you ignore these faith-based networks, you are ignoring the actual physical infrastructure that is holding back a complete collapse of the urban safety net.
Wow.
But operating that infrastructure, the doctors, the lawyers, the building maintenance, the food supply, it requires a level of capital that completely shatters the old way of thinking.
Right, which forces us to look at the financial engine. Because running an in-house medical clinic and a rehab center, that costs millions of dollars. You cannot fund a mega mission with whatever pocket change gets dropped in the offering plate on Sunday.
No, you definitely can't.
But my understanding of traditional religious charity is that there's a strong resistance to asking for money. There's this pervasive idea that if you are doing God's work, you should just pray and God will magically provide the funds.
Right, the prayer model.
Yeah. So how do these leaders reconcile aggressive multi-million-dollar fundraising with their faith?
That is the core psychological and spiritual tension for every single mission director in this era.
I bet.
For a long time, actively soliciting funds was viewed almost as a sin of doubt.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, like if you sent out a fundraising letter, you were signaling that you didn't trust God to provide.
Wow, that's a heavy burden.
But the text confronts this directly by examining the biblical precedent, specifically the actions of the Apostle Paul.
I'm curious how Paul fits into this because, he's usually associated with theology, not accounting.
Actually, Paul was a highly systematic fundraiser.
Really?
Yes. The authors point to his letters to the early churches. When Paul needed to raise funds for the impoverished believers in Jerusalem, he didn't just tell the church in Corinth to pray about it.
What did he do?
In 1 Corinthians, he gives them a highly structured, mechanical directive. He tells them that on the first day of every week, each person should set aside a specific sum of money in proportion to their income and save it up so that when he arrives, the collection is already done.
That is wild. He didn't invent passing the plate. He literally invented the recurring monthly donor program.
He really did.
He is instituting a structured pledge system.
Exactly. The theological argument made to these mission directors is that organizing a systematic, strategic financial campaign is not a lack of faith at all. It is obedience to a biblical model.
Right.
Faith and mechanics are not mutually exclusive. They are meant to work in tandem.
Okay, but even if you convince a director that it's okay to ask for money, well, how you ask for it matters. There's a chapter in the source material by an expert named John R. Frank that outlines the difference between fundraising and development. Can we unpack that? Because it seems like those words are just used interchangeably in the nonprofit world.
They are often used interchangeably, but Frank argues they represent two completely different philosophies.
Right.
So fundraising is entirely focused on the needs of the organization.
Like, what do we need right now?
Right. The organization needs 100 blankets, so they send out a letter asking for money for 100 blankets. It is a transactional, short-term exchange.
Got it.
Development, on the other hand, is outwardly focused on the donor. Frank defines development as the process of creating opportunities to link people who believe in the work with the work itself.
Let me see if I can translate this into a business context for you, the listener.
Yeah.
Let's say I own a local coffee shop.
Okay.
If I run out of cash to buy espresso beans, and I go to a bank to get a short-term loan, that's fundraising. It's transactional.
Exactly.
I need cash, you give me cash, I pay you back. The bank doesn't care about my coffee.
Correct.
But development is like a tech founder pitching an angel investor.
Ew, I like that.
The founder isn't just asking for cash to buy servers. The founder is saying, I have a vision that is going to disrupt this entire industry.
Yeah.
And I am inviting you to join me on the ground floor. I want your capital, yes, but I also want your expertise, your network, and your belief in this shared vision.
Yes.
You are inviting the investor to become an active participant in the mission's success.
That is a phenomenal analogy. When a mission shifts from fundraising to development, they stop treating their donors like ATMs.
Right.
And they start treating them like angel investors in the business of human redemption. And the financial results of making the psychological shift were just explosive.
Explosive.
Well, the book tracks the collective income of the International Union of Gospel Missions. By adopting this development mindset, their income skyrocketed from $50 million to $300 million in just 6 years.
I want you to really hear that number, a 600% increase in 6 years.
It's massive.
That does not happen by accident.
Yeah.
That happens because you fundamentally change the way you interface with your community.
Absolutely.
But here is my concern. If you are suddenly managing a $300 million collective enterprise, the guy who used to just preach the sermon and hand out the soup is no longer qualified to run the building.
You've hit on the exact crisis of leadership that the book details.
Yeah.
The evolution into a mega mission placed an agonizing burden on the executive directors.
I can only imagine.
Suddenly, these men and women who often got into this work purely out of a desire for spiritual counseling and frontline service, they were forced into the role of corporate CEOs.
Right, sitting in boardrooms.
Exactly. The data in the study revealed that these directors were spending an average of 40% of their time entirely on development and public relations.
So almost half of their working week is removed from the actual mission work. They are trapped in boardrooms and donor lunches.
And the emotional toll of that whiplash is severe. There is a deeply transparent admission from a mission administrator named Stephen Berger.
What does he say?
He writes about the sheer exhaustion of trying to manage the expanding frontline ministry while simultaneously driving a multi-million-dollar development engine.
Wow.
He admits quite bluntly that the dual role was, quote, killing me.
That's heartbreaking.
He felt entirely overextended, trying to be a spiritual shepherd to broken people in the morning and a slick corporate fundraiser in the afternoon.
How does a leader even survive that kind of whiplash? Because you can't just abandon the fundraising or the clinic shuts down.
Right.
But you can't abandon the ministry where you completely lose your soul.
The solution proposed in the text, drawing from management experts like Philip Kotler, is that the CEO must essentially embrace the role of Chief Marketing Officer.
A CMO.
Yes. And the core duty of a CMO is not just to ask for money, but to crystallize the vision of the organization so clearly that it practically markets itself. Confusion is the enemy of development.
Which reminds me of a brilliant example from the source material regarding mission statements.
Oh, yes.
Because it seems like the bigger an organization gets, the more words they use to describe what they do.
It's an institutional disease, really. Berger shares a story from his time serving on a Christian school board.
Okay.
They had developed a mission statement that was a full, single-spaced page of text.
Oh, no.
It was a massive wall of theological jargon and bureaucratic goals.
And let me guess, no one on the board could actually recite it.
No one could remember it, let alone a potential donor or a volunteer. It was entirely useless as a tool for development.
Right.
So a new superintendent steps in and realizes they need surgical clarity.
What does he do?
He throws out the page-long document and distills the entire complex operation of the school down to a single, evocative phrase taken from the book of Isaiah. Growing oaks of righteousness.
Growing oaks of righteousness. It's incredibly visual.
It is.
You immediately understand the process, growing something strong, deeply rooted over a long period of time. And you understand the moral outcome, which is righteousness.
Yeah.
You don't need a paragraph to explain a tree.
Exactly. When an exhausted CEO can distill a complex mega mission down to an oak of righteousness level of clarity, it aligns the staff, it inspires the donors.
Yeah.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, crucially, it helps the director navigate the turbulent waters of community politics.
Community politics. Let's talk about that, because operating a massive homeless shelter in a downtown commercial district is definitely going to ruffle some feathers.
Oh, it creates immense friction. Berger shares another story about taking over a facility where the mission and the local merchants association were essentially in a state of open warfare.
Open warfare.
Yeah. The merchants wanted pristine sidewalks for their retail customers, right? And the mission was serving the very people sleeping on those sidewalks. It was a hostile standoff.
Okay, let me play devil's advocate here.
Sure.
If I am the CEO of this mission and I am spending 40% of my time doing development, the temptation is going to be to compromise with the merchants just to keep the peace and protect my donor base.
Does the CMO role force the director to sell out the homeless to appease the local business owners?
That is the danger, absolutely. But Berger's approach shows how a skilled CMO builds bridges without compromising the mission.
How did he do it?
Well, instead of fighting over their obvious ideological differences, he sat down with the president of the Merchants Association to find practical common ground.
Okay.
They stopped arguing about the philosophy of poverty and started looking at the physical street. And they realized they actually agreed on quite a bit.
Such as? What could they possibly agree on?
They both agreed the neighborhood desperately needed accessible public restrooms.
Okay, that's practical.
They both agreed that parking logistics were a nightmare and needed streamlining.
Sure.
And they both agreed that chronic public disorderly conduct was hurting everyone, the businesses and the vulnerable individuals.
By focusing on these mutual practical goals, they transformed from enemies into a coalition that could lobby the city government together.
That is a masterclass in diplomacy. You don't surrender your values, you just find the intersection of mutual self-interest.
Exactly.
But, even with a brilliant CMO casting the vision and negotiating peace with the neighbors, a $300 million operation requires an army of labor.
It certainly
A
does.
CEO can't run a 24-hour medical clinic and a rehab center by themselves. They need a workforce.
And that brings us to the most vital economic and spiritual engine of the entire rescue mission apparatus, the volunteer force.
Right.
We are not just talking about a few nice people serving turkey on Thanksgiving here.
No.
We are talking about a highly structured, integrated workforce. The book highlights the experience of an administrator named Curtis Thomas at Haven of Rest Ministry.
Oh, I remember this.
Yeah. Under strategic leadership, their volunteer base grew to nearly 500 committed individuals working year-round.
And the economic value of that is staggering. If you think about your own business or household budget, imagine getting 500 people to work for you for free.
It's hard to even fathom.
The study actually quantified this. At the time, the local volunteer center valued this labor at roughly $12 an hour.
Which was significant then.
Exactly.
Yeah.
When you multiply $12 an hour by 500 people working hundreds of hours a year, you are looking at millions of dollars in subsidized labor.
Yeah.
It is the invisible economic pillar holding these buildings up.
It is a massive subsidy. But the author makes a critical point here.
What's that?
If you only view volunteers as free labor, you are completely missing their true value in the development cycle we talked about earlier.
Interesting.
Research highlighted in the text proves that volunteers are actually your most lucrative potential donors.
Really?
Yes. People who volunteer eventually give financially, and they give at a much higher, more sustained level than people who only interact via the mail.
Why is the conversion rate so high? Is it just guilt?
No, it's the psychology of value exchange.
Wow.
When you sit in your living room and write a $50 check to a charity you saw on TV, it's abstract.
Right. You just put it in the mail and forget about it.
Exactly. But when you physically walk into a mission, spend 4 hours tutoring a man in recovery, and see the lights come back on in his eyes, the connection is visceral.
It's real.
You are no longer funding a concept. You are funding a transformation you actively participated in.
There's an incredible story in the source material that perfectly captures this trajectory from volunteer to fully invested partner.
Yes.
It's about a young corporate executive who comes to Haven of Rest.
This is a phenomenal anecdote. The text describes a highly successful, driven young woman. She is the vice president of her family's corporate business.
So she's very worldly, very corporate.
Very. And for whatever reason, she decides she wants to volunteer at the mission.
And you would think if a corporate VP walks into a charity, the charity would immediately put her on the board of directors.
You would think.
Like, we need your business acumen. Come sit in this leather chair.
Yeah.
But that's not what they do.
Not at all. They start her out by having her pull weeds in the flower beds around the exterior of the building.
That's wild.
She is literally down in the dirt doing those basic manual labor. But she commits to it.
Yeah.
And as she spends time pulling weeds week after week, she is observing the ecosystem of the mission. She is watching the staff interact with the broken people walking through the doors. She is witnessing the tangible reality of the ministry.
And it completely short-circuits her corporate worldview.
It transforms her entirely. The text notes that through this simple act of volunteering, she makes a profound personal spiritual commitment.
Wow.
But it doesn't stop there. The development aspect takes hold so deeply that she actually resigns her lucrative position as corporate vice president.
She quit her job.
She leaves her family's business, and she joins the rescue mission as their very first paid coordinator of volunteers.
That is the ultimate ROI on a volunteer program.
Isn't it?
I mean, you get your flower beds weeded, and in exchange, you recruit a highly trained corporate executive to run your HR department. But I imagine building a volunteer culture that can achieve that kind of result isn't exactly easy.
It requires immense intentionality. The authors issue a very stark warning to mission directors.
What's the warning?
They say that a volunteer program will inevitably fail. It will become toxic if it is treated as a stepchild department. If the executive director and the board of trustees view volunteers merely as an annoying necessity or secondary to the quote-unquote real paid staff, that attitude will bleed down.
Right, it trickles down.
The paid staff will treat the volunteers poorly, the volunteers will feel unappreciated, and they will leave. And when they leave, the mission loses both its free labor and its best future donors. It must be championed from the absolute top.
Okay, so we have the CEO casting the vision. We have 500 volunteers pulling weeds and tutoring in the rehab center.
Right.
That covers the local on-the-ground engagement. But to fund a $300 million national network, you have to reach beyond the people who can physically drive to your building.
You do.
You have to reach tens of thousands of remote donors. Right. And historically, that meant direct mail.
Yes.
But here's where it gets really interesting.
Yeah.
There is a fascinating chapter here by an expert named Robert Hobbs, who essentially declares that the old way of doing direct mail is totally dead.
It is a radical shift in fundraising strategy. For decades, the mantra of direct mail was acquisition.
Just get new names.
Exactly. The goal was simply to buy massive mailing lists, blast out millions of letters, and acquire as many new names as possible. It was a volume game.
Hobbs points out that the underlying economics of that volume game fundamentally broke down. Why did acquisition die?
Because the market became completely saturated and hyper expensive. Think about the mechanics of direct mail.
Okay.
You have to pay a list broker for the names, you have to pay for the graphic design, the printing, the envelopes, and the ever-increasing cost of postage. In the direct mail world, a 1% to 2% response rate is considered successful.
Wait. If you send out 1,000 letters and 20 people send back a check, that's a win.
Yes. But when you factor in the massive upfront costs of printing and postage against that tiny response rate, the math flips.
Right.
Hobbs points out that the cost to acquire a new donor suddenly exceeded the value of their initial gift.
Ouch.
Right. If it costs you $35 in marketing expenses to acquire a $25 initial donation, you are operating at a net loss on the front end.
That is a terrifying reality for a nonprofit. If your primary growth engine is actually losing you money, you have to completely pivot.
And the pivot was from acquisition to retention.
Yep.
If you're taking a loss to get a new donor in the door, your entire survival depends on keeping them engaged for years so that their second, third, and 50th donations make up the deficit. You have to build intense long-term loyalty.
And how do you build that loyalty? You can't just keep sending them the exact same letter asking for money for soup.
No, you can't.
The text uses an absolutely brilliant analogy here to explain how missions had to change their messaging. It's the Kodak analogy.
This is one of the most powerful marketing insights in the book.
Think about this. Back when we all bought physical film and photo paper, Kodak was the absolute king of the industry.
Right.
But when you watched a Kodak commercial on television, they never once mentioned the chemical features of their product.
Never.
They didn't brag about the silver halide crystals or the exact thickness of the paper stock or the chemical saturation levels of the dye. If they had pitched features, no one would have bought it.
Because the consumer doesn't care about the chemistry.
Right. What Kodak sold was the benefit. They showed you a commercial of a grandfather seeing his new grandchild for the first time, or a father walking his daughter down the aisle.
Emotional connection.
Yes. Kodak sold the promise that your most precious fleeting memories would be captured and preserved forever. They sold emotional outcomes.
And Hobbs applies this directly to the rescue mission. For a very long time, missions were trapped in the habit of selling features.
What does that look like?
Well, their newsletters would say, your $2 provides one bowl of soup. Your $10 provides one night on a mattress. That is selling silver halide crystals. It's transactional.
Exactly. You are commoditizing your charity. You are making it sound like a cheap motel.
But in the new era of retention, donors want to fund benefits. They want to fund outcomes. They don't want to buy a $2 bowl of soup. They want to fund the transformation of a human life.
That's powerful.
They want to know that their donation resulted in a father getting sober, reuniting with his family, and holding down a job. They want the Kodak moment of redemption.
This connects beautifully to a psychological concept Hobbes talks about called shared aspirations.
Yeah.
If I am a donor, I don't just want a tax receipt. I want to feel like I am partnering with you to fix a problem in my city that breaks my heart.
Right.
I have an aspiration to see my community healed. If your newsletter treats me like a partner who shares that aspiration, I will stay with you for decades.
It elevates the donor from a passive wallet to an active stakeholder. And this stakeholder mentality is absolutely critical when the mission has to make the leap from funding daily soup to funding actual concrete and steel.
Buildings.
Right. Because direct mail, even brilliant, emotionally resonant direct mail, is designed to fund operating budgets. It pays the utility bills and buys the food. But what happens when the actual 80-year-old building you are operating out of is condemned?
You can't buy a $5 million modern medical facility $25 at a time through the mail.
No.
The math simply doesn't scale. And that brings us to the most high-stakes arena of nonprofit finance, the capital campaign.
The necessity for capital campaigns was universal. The study data showed that nearly 70% of mission directors were planning to drastically increase their fundraising staff size.
Wow.
And the reason was infrastructure. These inner-city buildings from the 1930s and 40s were collapsing.
It's literally crumbling.
They lacked modern HVAC, they weren't ADA compliant, and they certainly weren't zoned to house the complex medical and psychological clinics we discussed earlier. They desperately needed new facilities to execute the mega mission strategy.
But launching a multi-million-dollar capital campaign requires a completely different level of governance.
Oh, totally.
You need a board of directors that can leverage deep community connections to ask for 6- and 7-figure checks. And the book drops a massive bombshell about the state of these boards.
It is a truly shocking revelation, provided again by Stephen Berger.
Let's hear it.
Remember, Berger had served on national boards for heavy-hitting organizations like the Christian Management Association and the Evangelical Council for Financial Accountability.
So he knows his stuff.
He had seen the absolute highest levels of nonprofit governance. Yet, he writes that in his entire career, he can only recall one single organization that required specific, rigorous training for new board members before they took their seats.
Let that sink in. You are asking volunteers to govern a complex, highly regulated corporation dealing with life and death social issues, managing millions of dollars in capital, and you give them zero onboarding.
The standard operating procedure across the industry was entirely ad hoc.
Unbelievable.
A local businessman or a well-meaning pastor would be recruited, they would show up to their first board meeting, and they were expected to simply hit the ground running. Berger realized this was systemic negligence.
It's a recipe for disaster. If a board member doesn't intimately understand the theology, the legal liabilities, and the strategic vision of the mission, how on earth can you expect them to sit across from a wealthy philanthropist and confidently ask for $1 million?
You can't. Which is why the transition to a mega mission required a professionalization of the board.
Right.
And when you do have a trained, aligned board, and you are ready to approach those high-level donors, the strategy of the ask becomes an absolute art form.
This is where we have to talk about Don Johnson's strategy in the book.
Yeah.
This is, without a doubt, a masterclass in understanding donor psychology.
Right.
Let's set the stage. Johnson is trying to raise major capital for a gritty inner-city homeless shelter.
Right.
And he identifies a highly lucrative family foundation in his city.
But there is a massive obstacle.
Huge.
This specific family foundation has a legally binding mandate. They exclusively fund the arts and culture.
Currently arts and culture.
Right. They write giant checks to the symphony, the local art museum, and the ballet. They explicitly do not fund human welfare services, and they certainly do not fund homeless shelters.
If I'm a rookie fundraiser, I look at that foundation's mandate, I cross them off my list, and I move on. It's a waste of time. I mean, how on earth do you pitch a homeless shelter to an arts foundation?
Most would walk away. But Johnson understands the development mindset.
Okay.
He understands that he needs to find the shared aspiration between his shelter and their cultural mandate. He realizes that the board members of this foundation care deeply about the patrons of the arts, having an elevated, beautiful experience in the downtown cultural district.
So he secures a meeting, And he doesn't go in begging for the poor.
No.
He completely reframes the pitch. He essentially tells them, you are pouring millions of dollars in making this city a vibrant cultural hub. You are funding incredible symphonies and beautiful art galleries.
Right.
But your investment is entirely undermined if your patrons cannot walk from their parking garage to the symphony hall without being confronted by extreme poverty, aggressively panhandled, and forced to step over people sleeping on the pavement. You cannot have true culture in a city that is decaying at its core.
It is a brilliant surgical strike on their underlying motivation.
That's genius.
He continues by saying, if you want to protect your massive investment in the arts, you need to invest in our facility so we can get these individuals off your sidewalks, into safe housing, and through recovery. He isn't selling the features of the shelter. He is selling them the exact benefit they are mandated to buy, a safe, thriving cultural district.
And it worked. They wrote him a large six-figure check.
Yes, they did.
That story proves that high-level fundraising isn't about guilt trips. It's about deeply understanding the ecosystem of your city and showing a donor how your mission solves their problem.
It is high-level corporate strategy applied to human welfare. But there is a dark side to this success.
Oh.
As these missions master these techniques, as they successfully raise tens of millions, buy up city blocks, and build these sprawling mega facilities, they trigger a massive backlash from the very communities they are trying to save.
The community pushback. This is where Ivan Fahs concludes his analysis, and it deals with the sociology of neighborhood resistance.
Yes.
The acronyms he highlights that city planners and developers use to describe this resistance are both darkly funny and incredibly frustrating.
Everyone is familiar with the first one. NIMBY.
NIMBY. Not in my backyard. If you poll a neighborhood, 100% of people agree that a state-of-the-art drug rehab facility is a wonderful, necessary thing. They just want to build 3 zip codes away, completely out of their sightline.
NIMBY is the direct line. But as the missions grew larger, the bureaucratic resistance intensified. Planners introduced the term LULU, which stands for locally unwanted land use.
Wow.
This is where neighborhoods weaponize zoning laws, environmental impact studies, and parking ordinances to legally bleed a charity dry so they abandon their building project.
They can't attack the charity's mission because that looks bad, so they attack their parking ratio.
Exactly.
But my absolute favorite, and the one that truly captures the anxiety of the modern city, is BANANA.
It perfectly encapsulates the irrationality of the opposition.
BANANA stands for build absolutely nothing anywhere near anything.
It's just nuts.
It is the ultimate expression of urban paralysis. The community is terrified of the homeless crisis. They demand someone fix it. But the moment a sophisticated mega mission secures the funding to actually build the infrastructure required to fix it, the community panics about property values and blocks the construction.
This raises an important question. How do missions maintain trust in that kind of environment?
Yeah, how do they?
This intense public scrutiny forces the mega missions to confront a terrifying ethical landscape. The public was already primed to distrust religious charities asking for millions of dollars.
Right, because of these scandals.
Exactly. The 1980s and 90s were marred by massive, highly publicized scandals involving television evangelists.
Oh, absolutely.
There were front-page controversies regarding the exorbitant salaries of officials at organizations like the United Way. And the philanthropic world was still reeling from the devastating collapse of the Foundation for New Era Philanthropy, which turned out to be a massive Ponzi scheme.
So you are trying to build a multi-million-dollar facility in a banana neighborhood, asking for money from a public that has just watched several major charities go to prison for fraud.
Yes.
How do you survive that level of cynicism?
By elevating financial transparency from a mere legal accounting requirement to a core theological conviction. The text emphasizes that these successful mission directors came to view the act of financial management itself as a ministry.
That's a huge shift.
If you are going to solicit public dollars under the banner of divine work, then keeping the public meticulously informed, opening your books, submitting to rigorous third-party audits, that isn't just good PR, it is an ethical and spiritual imperative.
Transparency becomes the ultimate apologetic.
Exactly.
If a community expects you to be a grifter and you hand them a perfectly balanced, audited financial statement showing exact ROI on every dollar, you completely shatter their cynicism.
You cannot claim to run a spiritual enterprise if your back-office accounting is shrouded in darkness. Integrity in the boardroom is just as critical as compassion in the soup line.
This has been an incredibly dense, eye-opening journey today. Let's synthesize everything we've unpacked.
Let's go.
The narrative of this book, the journey from a small storefront offering soup and a sermon to a sprawling multi-million-dollar mega mission, is easily misunderstood.
It is.
A cynic might look at this and say these organizations lost their soul. They traded simple faith for corporate marketing, high-pressure capital campaigns, and slick PR.
But the data and the history show the exact opposite.
Right. It's a story of survival and necessary evolution. The streets became hostile.
Very hostile.
The problems, crack epidemics, systemic homelessness, untreated mental illness, became too massive for a mom-and-pop operation to handle. These leaders didn't corporatize because they were greedy. They corporatized because the scale of human suffering demanded it.
Right.
They had to learn how to pitch arts foundations, how to calculate the economic impact of a volunteer pulling weeds, and how to write a mission statement that cuts through the noise. They armed their deep spiritual compassion with top-tier business acumen to literally save lives on a scale that the 1950s storefronts could never have dreamed of.
It completely reframes our definition of what constitutes spiritual work.
It really does.
And I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over. When you drive through your city and see the immense, heartbreaking scale of the crises on our streets, may the most purely spiritual thing a group of people can do isn't just to sit in a quiet room and pray for intervention.
Yeah.
Maybe the most profoundly spiritual act is to organize a perfectly executed, data-driven, relentless capital campaign to build a state-of-the-art medical and recovery facility. Does treating charity like a rigorous, demanding profession actually honor the dignity of the poor far more than treating it like a casual, amateur side project?
What an incredible question to leave us with. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive.
My pleasure.
We hope this conversation arms you with a new, multifaceted lens the next time you look at the charities and missions operating in your own neighborhood. Behind those walls, there is a complex engine of volunteers, a sophisticated theology of fundraising, and a vital, relentless effort to restore human dignity. Until next time, keep diving deep.